November 2nd, 1942. In his command vehicle somewhere in the Egyptian desert, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel read the message from Hitler 3 times, his hands steady but his jaw tight. The British 8th Army had broken through his lines at El Alamein. His Afrika Korps was in full retreat. Fuel tanks were nearly empty. Ammunition was critically low. And Hitler's message ordered him to stand fast, to yield not 1 meter of ground, to achieve victory or death. Rommel sat in silence for a long moment. Around him, staff officers waited. Outside, the sounds of retreat continued, trucks grinding westward, wounded men crying out, the distant thunder of British artillery growing closer. He had asked for permission to conduct an orderly withdrawal to save his army. Hitler's response made clear that permission would not be granted. He began dictating his reply. The words were careful, formal, precisely military in their phrasing. But between the lines, anyone who knew Rommel could read the desperation. His troops had fought to the last cartridge at every position. They had held until British tanks were literally overrunning their positions. The order to stand fast was physically impossible to execute. The army would be destroyed. He sent the message. Then he ordered the retreat to continue. That moment, that exchange of messages on November 2nd, marked the beginning of a 6-month collapse that would end with the surrender of over 275,000 Axis troops in Tunisia. And throughout those 6 months, the reactions of German High Command would reveal a chasm between reality in North Africa and perception in Berlin, between what field commanders knew to be true and what Hitler was willing to believe. The gap between those two realities would kill tens of thousands of men. Hitler's stand-fast order was not unusual. He had issued similar commands before, most notably during the winter crisis outside Moscow the previous year. In that case, his refusal to allow retreat had arguably prevented a complete collapse. He believed his will had saved the Eastern Front. Now he expected his will to save North Africa. But North Africa was not Russia. The distances were different. The supply situation was catastrophic in a different way. And most critically, Rommel's army was not dug into winter positions with some hope of resupply. It was a mobile force in full retreat, burning its last fuel, firing its last ammunition, pursued by an enemy with overwhelming material superiority. None of this mattered to Hitler. In the map room of his headquarters in East Prussia, North Africa was a front line on a map, a position to be held, a matter of will and determination. The physical realities, the fuel gauges reading empty, the supply ships sinking in the Mediterranean, the actual tactical situation, these were details that interfered with the clarity of his strategic vision. Rommel disobeyed the stand-fast order. He had no choice. To obey would have meant the immediate destruction of his entire force. So he retreated, sending increasingly desperate messages to justify each withdrawal, each abandoned position, each 100 kilometers given up. And with each message, he painted a clearer picture of catastrophe. The British had over 1,000 tanks. Rommel had fewer than 30 operational. The British had unlimited ammunition. Rommel's artillery was rationing shells. The British had fuel to maneuver freely. Rommel's vehicles were being abandoned when they ran dry. These were not excuses, they were mathematical facts. The Afrika Korps was being arithmetically eliminated. In Berlin, the reaction evolved through stages, each one revealing different layers of German command culture. At the operational level, the officers of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the OKW, understood immediately what Rommel's messages meant. These were professional soldiers. They could read a tactical situation. They knew what fuel shortages meant for a mechanized army. They knew what ammunition shortages meant for defensive positions. They knew that Rommel was describing an army in the process of disintegration. But their understanding did not translate into action. The OKW's role was not to make strategic decisions. It was to transmit Hitler's orders and to provide the staff work to implement those orders. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, the OKW chief, was known throughout the German military as a yes man, someone who would never contradict Hitler, who would find reasons to justify whatever Hitler decided. His chief of operations, Alfred Jodl, was more independently minded but ultimately no more willing to directly challenge Hitler's judgment. So the OKW's response was to demand more information, to question Rommel's assessments, to suggest that perhaps the situation was not quite as dire as Rommel claimed. They asked about Italian units that might be used to hold positions. They suggested tactical adjustments that might conserve fuel. They transmitted Hitler's continuing insistence that ground must not be yielded. They did everything except acknowledge the fundamental reality. The Afrika Korps was beaten and in full retreat. At the strategic level, the reaction was even more disconnected from reality. Hitler's view of North Africa was shaped by his broader strategic situation. In November 1942, Germany was fully committed in Russia, where the 6th Army was fighting in Stalingrad and Army Group A was pushing into the Caucasus. These were the campaigns that mattered to Hitler, the campaigns that would decide the war. North Africa was a secondary theater, important for prestige and for protecting the southern flank of Fortress Europe, but not decisive. From this perspective, Rommel's retreat looked like a failure of will rather than a response to material impossibility. Hitler had sent Rommel to Africa. Hitler had built up Rommel's reputation. Hitler had given Rommel the tools to win, or so Hitler believed. If Rommel was now retreating, it must be because Rommel lacked the determination to stand and fight. This interpretation was reinforced by the other voice Hitler was hearing from the Mediterranean theater: Field Marshal Albert Kesselring. Kesselring was Commander-in-Chief South, responsible for all German forces in the Mediterranean. He was an optimist by nature, a former Luftwaffe officer who believed that determination and aggressive action could overcome material disadvantages. And critically, Kesselring was not on the ground in the desert watching his tanks run out of fuel. He was in Rome, looking at maps, receiving reports filtered through multiple levels of command, and maintaining relationships with the Italians. Kesselring's assessments consistently contradicted Rommel's. Where Rommel reported catastrophic fuel shortages, Kesselring suggested that better logistics management could improve the situation. Where Rommel described overwhelming British superiority, Kesselring pointed to defensive positions that could be held. Where Rommel requested permission to retreat to Libya or even Tunisia, Kesselring advocated standing and fighting. Hitler preferred Kesselring's assessments. They aligned with what Hitler wanted to believe. They suggested that the situation was difficult but not hopeless, that leadership and determination could still achieve success, that Rommel's pessimism was the problem rather than the symptom. This created a bizarre dynamic. Rommel, on the ground, was describing reality. Kesselring, hundreds of miles away, was describing possibility. And Hitler, over 1,000 miles away in East Prussia, was choosing to believe possibility over reality. The consequences played out across 1,400 miles of desert. Rommel retreated from El Alamein to Fuka, then to Mersa Matruh, then to Sidi Barrani, each position abandoned when British pressure made it untenable. He retreated across the Libyan border, through Bardia, through Tobruk, the fortress he had besieged for 8 months in 1941, now given up in a day. He retreated through Benghazi, through El Agheila, through the entire length of Cyrenaica. At each stage, he requested permission to continue withdrawing. At each stage, Hitler initially refused, then grudgingly consented when the alternative was encirclement and destruction. And at each stage, the gap between Hitler's orders and Rommel's actions grew wider. The messages between Rommel and High Command during this period reveal the deteriorating relationship. Rommel's tone shifted from formal military reporting to barely concealed frustration. He stopped requesting permission and started informing headquarters of withdrawals already underway. He began making decisions based on tactical necessity rather than strategic orders. Hitler's messages in return grew sharper. References to duty appeared more frequently. Reminders of the need for fanatical resistance. Implications that Rommel's leadership was faltering. The subtext was clear. Hitler was losing faith in Rommel, but the situation was about to become far more complicated. On November 8, 1942, 6 days after Rommel began his retreat from El Alamein, American and British forces landed in Morocco and Algeria. Operation Torch brought over 100,000 Allied troops into North Africa, landing at Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers. The entire strategic situation transformed overnight. Rommel was no longer just retreating from a superior British force. He was retreating toward a second Allied army advancing from the west. North Africa was becoming a trap, with Allied forces closing in from 2 directions. The German High Command's reaction to Torch revealed the full depth of their strategic confusion. The initial response was shock. German intelligence had failed to predict the landings, the scale of the operation, the distance it had been organized from across the Atlantic, the successful deception campaign, all of it caught German command by surprise. For several hours, there was genuine uncertainty about what was happening and what it meant. Then Hitler made a decision that would define the final chapter of the North African campaign. Instead of recognizing that the Axis position in North Africa had become untenable, instead of attempting to evacuate Rommel's experienced troops while there was still time, Hitler decided to reinforce. He ordered troops rushed to Tunisia. He ordered the Luftwaffe to establish air superiority over the Tunisian coast. He ordered the Italian Navy to run supply convoys at maximum effort. He committed to holding North Africa, not just as a temporary defensive measure, but as a permanent strategic position. The reasoning behind this decision was complex and revealed Hitler's strategic thinking at this critical moment of the war. Tunisia, he believed, was different from the open desert. It had mountains, defensive terrain, ports that could be supplied across the relatively short distance from Sicily. The Allies would have to attack prepared positions rather than maneuver in open terrain. German troops, properly supplied and led, could hold Tunisia indefinitely. More importantly, holding Tunisia protected Sicily and Italy. If North Africa fell, the Allies would have a jumping-off point for invading southern Europe. The entire Mediterranean would be at risk. Better to fight in Tunisia than in Sicily or on the Italian mainland. There was logic to this analysis. Tunisia did offer better defensive terrain. The supply lines from Sicily were shorter than the long route to Libya had been, and preventing an Allied invasion of southern Europe was a legitimate strategic concern. But the analysis ignored several critical realities. First, it assumed adequate supply capacity across the Mediterranean, when in fact Allied air and naval forces were already making the crossing increasingly deadly. Second, it assumed that fresh troops rushed to Tunisia could be properly equipped and organized, when in fact they would arrive piecemeal and be thrown into battle without adequate preparation. Third, and most critically, it assumed that Rommel's retreating Africa Corps could link up with the new forces in Tunisia and form a coherent defensive front. That last assumption required Rommel to conduct a fighting retreat across the entire length of Libya, maintaining unit cohesion, preserving enough combat power to be useful upon arrival in Tunisia, all while pursued by Montgomery's 8th Army and with fuel and ammunition running critically low. Rommel's messages during this period took on a different character. He was no longer just reporting tactical situations. He was warning of strategic disaster. His Africa Corps was disintegrating. Vehicles were being abandoned daily. Units were losing cohesion. The Italian divisions that made up much of his force were collapsing, their soldiers surrendering or deserting in large numbers. The army that had won spectacular victories in 1941 and early 1942 was ceasing to exist as an effective fighting force, and High Command's response was to order him to hurry to Tunisia, where fresh troops were arriving and where a new defensive line would be established. The disconnect had become complete. Rommel was describing an army dying. Hitler was planning a campaign. In December 1942, Rommel's health collapsed. The strain of the retreat, the frustration of dealing with high command, the physical exhaustion of continuous combat, all of it caught up with him. He developed severe headaches, circulation problems, digestive issues. His staff noticed him becoming more irritable, more withdrawn, less able to focus. He requested leave to recover in Germany. The request was initially denied. The situation was too critical, his presence too important. But as his condition worsened, High Command reluctantly agreed. In March 1943, Rommel left Africa, officially on sick leave, unofficially never to return. His departure removed the one voice that had been consistently telling Hitler the truth about North Africa. The commanders who replaced him, first Giovanni Messe for the Italian First Army and Hans-Jürgen von Arnim for the 5th Panzer Army, were competent but lacked Rommel's prestige and his willingness to argue with Hitler. The result was that Hitler's understanding of the North African situation became even more detached from reality. Through March and April 1943, the Axis position in Tunisia steadily deteriorated. The Allies tightened their grip on the perimeter. Supply convoys from Sicily faced increasingly heavy air attacks. Fuel shortages became critical. Ammunition stocks dwindled. The Luftwaffe lost air superiority. And the messages from Tunisia to Berlin took on an increasingly desperate tone. Von Arnim's reports documented the collapse in clinical detail. He listed the units that were combat ineffective due to losses. He provided figures on fuel consumption versus fuel received. He described the tactical situation in each sector, the Allied pressure building, the defensive lines bending. But he also, like Rommel before him, requested permission to conduct tactical withdrawals, to shorten the defensive perimeter, to consolidate forces. And like Rommel before him, he received orders to hold every position, to conduct counterattacks, to maintain aggressive defense. The pattern had become institutionalized. Field commanders reported reality. High Command ordered them to change reality through willpower. Kesselring's role during this final phase was particularly significant. He remained optimistic about Tunisia's defensibility, even as the situation became obviously hopeless. His reports to Hitler emphasized the strength of defensive positions, the arrival of reinforcements, the difficulties the Allies were having in coordinating their attacks. Some historians have debated whether Kesselring genuinely believed his optimistic assessments, or whether he was telling Hitler what Hitler wanted to hear. The evidence suggests a mixture of both. Kesselring was by nature an optimist, someone who looked for opportunities rather than dwelling on difficulties. But he was also a skilled political operator who understood how to maintain Hitler's confidence. Whatever his motivations, his assessments gave Hitler reason to continue believing that Tunisia could be held, even as the tactical situation made that increasingly impossible. By late April 1943, the end was approaching. Allied forces had compressed the Axis perimeter into a small pocket in northeastern Tunisia. Over 250,000 Axis troops were trapped, their backs to the sea, with no possibility of evacuation and no possibility of breaking out. The supplies getting through from Sicily had dwindled to a trickle. Fuel was so scarce that tanks were being used as stationary pillboxes. Ammunition was being strictly rationed. Food supplies were running low. Medical supplies were exhausted. And still, the orders from Berlin were to hold, to fight, to resist. On May 6th, the Allies launched their final offensive. British forces attacked toward Tunis from the west. American forces attacked toward Bizerte from the northwest. French forces pressed from the south. The Axis perimeter collapsed in days. Von Arnim's final messages to Berlin described the disintegration. Units were surrendering en masse. Defensive lines were evaporating. Command and control was breaking down. The end was imminent. Hitler's response was to order continued resistance. Every position was to be held. Every man was to fight to the last. Tunisia was to become another Stalingrad, a fortress that would tie down Allied forces and demonstrate German determination. But Tunisia was not Stalingrad. There was no possibility of relief. There was no possibility of resupply. There was no strategic purpose to continued resistance except to delay the inevitable by days. On May 13, 1943, the last Axis forces in Tunisia surrendered. Over 275,000 men went into captivity, including 100,000 Germans. It was one of the largest surrenders in military history, comparable to Stalingrad 4 months earlier. The reaction in Berlin was stunned silence. Hitler had lost 2 armies in 5 months. 6th Army at Stalingrad in February. The Afrika Korps and its reinforcements in Tunisia in May. Over 500,000 men killed or captured. Entire divisions erased from the order of battle. Years of training and equipment lost. And unlike Stalingrad, where the surrounded troops had fought to literal destruction, in Tunisia, over 200,000 men had surrendered while still capable of fighting. They had given up because continued resistance was pointless, because they were out of supplies, because the situation was hopeless. This was the part Hitler could not accept. In the days following the surrender, Hitler's comments about North Africa revealed his interpretation of what had happened. He did not acknowledge that his strategy had been flawed, that his refusal to evacuate when evacuation was possible had doomed the troops, that his insistence on reinforcing Tunisia had simply provided more prisoners for the Allies. Instead, he focused on the surrender itself. The troops had given up. They had not fought to the last man. They had not demonstrated the fanatical resistance he had ordered. The failure was not strategic. It was moral. This interpretation would have profound consequences for how Hitler conducted the rest of the war. The lesson he took from North Africa was not that he needed to listen to field commanders, not that material realities mattered, not that willpower alone could not overcome impossible situations. The lesson he took was that German soldiers needed to be more fanatical, more willing to die, more resistant to the temptation to surrender. The stand-fast orders would become more frequent and more absolute. The punishment for unauthorized withdrawal would become more severe. The expectation that units would fight to complete destruction would become standard. North Africa had taught Hitler exactly the wrong lesson. For the field commanders, the survivors who had tried to tell the truth and been ignored, the collapse of North Africa was vindication and tragedy mixed together. They had been right about the tactical situation. They had accurately assessed what was possible and what was not. They had tried to save their men, and they had been overruled at every stage by a command structure that preferred comforting illusions to uncomfortable realities. Rommel, recovering in Germany, learned of the final surrender while on sick leave. His reaction, recorded in letters and later memoirs, was bitter resignation. He had known this was coming. He had warned it was coming. He had begged for permission to evacuate while evacuation was possible, and he had been ignored. The 250,000 men who surrendered in Tunisia included many who had served under him in the Afrika Korps, who had fought across the desert, who had trusted that their commanders knew what they were doing. Now they would spend the rest of the war in prisoner camps, not because they had been defeated in battle, but because High Command had refused to accept defeat when accepting it might have saved them. The gap between what German High Command said and what German High Command knew was never wider than in those final months of the North African campaign. The messages sent from Tunisia described disaster. The orders sent from Berlin demanded miracles, and in between, thousands of men died or went into captivity because the people making strategic decisions refused to acknowledge what the people fighting the battles were telling them. It was a pattern that would repeat, with variations, on every front for the rest of the war. The Eastern Front, the Western Front, Italy, the final battle for Germany itself, all would see the same dynamic. Field commanders reporting impossible situations, high command ordering impossible solutions, and soldiers dying in the gap between reality and ideology. North Africa was where that pattern became fully established, where the mechanisms of self-deception and willful blindness became institutionalized at the highest levels of German command. The words German High Command said when North Africa collapsed revealed not just their reaction to a military defeat, but the fundamental dysfunction that would characterize German strategic decision-making for the remainder of the war. They said hold when withdrawal was necessary. They said fight when surrender was inevitable. They said victory was possible when defeat was certain. And they kept saying these things, kept issuing these orders, kept demanding these impossibilities, even as the evidence mounted that their words had lost all connection to the reality their soldiers faced. That was what German High Command said when North Africa collapsed. And that was why the collapse, when it came, was so much worse than it needed to be.